Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today, we're tackling a pretty huge question in global politics. The kind of thing that keeps diplomats up at night. Can the U.S., can they really pull Russia away from China? And we've got some really interesting analysis here that gets into the nitty-gritty of how that might or might not play out.
Yeah, this isn't just some think tank theory. It digs deep into the history, the strategies, the real politic of this whole, three-way power struggle thing.
So for this deep dive, we want to get beyond the usual headlines and, really unpack the dynamics of this whole U.S.-Russia-China triangle. Where are the pressure points? What are the potential roadblocks?
Right, right. And I think the analysis does a really good job of sort of like cutting through the noise and getting to some pretty uncomfortable truths about, just how tough this is going to be for Washington.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What's the current U.S. strategy? What are they actually doing to try to drive a wedge between Moscow and Beijing?
Well, the analysis, it lays out pretty clearly that the administration, they're actively trying to stir the pot between Russia and China. Create some friction, maybe exploit some existing tensions.
So the thinking is that if they can get Russia to act against China's interests, that puts pressure on Beijing, maybe forces them to give the U.S. what it wants on other issues.
Exactly. It's a pretty high stakes gamble. They're betting that they can leverage this potential rivalry, this tension between these two giants.
But the analysis we're looking at, it's not exactly optimistic about this approach, right? It sounds pretty skeptical. Why is that? What are the big reasons for that doubt?
Yeah, the author, they make a really compelling case that the U.S., its ability to really throw its weight around, it's been diminished. And one of the main reasons is they point to strained relations with America's own allies.
Interesting. So it's not just about like the U.S.'s own power, it's also about the strength of its alliances. If those are weak, then it's harder to pressure, well, anyone, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Leverage in geopolitics, it comes from more than just, military might or economic strength. It comes from this whole network of relationships and partnerships, this web of influence. And if that web starts to unravel, well, you lose a lot of your ability to shape events.
So it's kind of like if you're trying to, I don't know, pull a rope and half the people on your team are pulling in a different direction, it's not going to be very effective, is it?
Exactly. And the analysis even suggests that some U.S. allies, they're not just sitting on the sidelines here. They're actually thinking about taking matters into their own hands, maybe getting tougher on Moscow, even if it means going it alone, forming a coalition without the U.S. if they feel like Washington isn't being tough enough.
Wow. Okay, so that's a pretty significant development.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, about past efforts to try to influence Russia. The analysis mentions like Merkel's change through trade policy, the idea that by increasing economic ties, you could somehow nudge Russia in a more democratic direction.
Right. And as Bill Emmett has pointed out, that approach, it didn't really pan out, did it? It's a good reminder that economic interdependence, it doesn't automatically translate into, political alignment, especially when you're dealing with someone like Putin. And the analysis kind of contrasts that with the current U.S. approach, which it describes as, kind of passive, almost like they're just taking Putin at his word without really trying to actively shape his actions.
So we're seeing a lot of skepticism about the current U.S. strategy, both in terms of its potential effectiveness and in terms of the potential consequences for U.S. alliances. But to really understand this dynamic, I think we have to go back a bit. The analysis takes us all the way back to the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Why is that moment so significant?
The 2008 Olympics, it's fascinating, right? It's this snapshot of a very different world. You had China really wanting to showcase this idea of a G2 partnership with the U.S., like two superpowers kind of running the show together. And at the opening ceremony, you had Hu Jintao, the Chinese president, sitting right next to George W. Bush, and then there was Putin, kind of off to the side.
So China was really, really looking to build that relationship with the U.S.
Yeah, it seemed like they were very much prioritizing that relationship. But then on that very same day, something else happened, something that really, I think, foreshadowed the challenges that the U.S. faces today.
Right, because while all of that was happening in Beijing, Russia was making its own moves.
Exactly. While the world was focused on the Olympics, Russia went ahead and invaded Georgia. They seized the region of South Ossetia, and, there was a ceasefire pretty quickly, but the analysis suggests that the West kind of kind of downplayed the whole thing at the time. Maybe they were distracted by the Olympics. Maybe they didn't want to, rock the boat too much. But it's an important reminder that even back then, Russia was willing to go its own way, to pursue its own interests, even if it meant, going against the grain, challenging the existing order.
And then fast forward to 2014, and we see another really pivotal moment, Russia's annexation of Crimea. And what's striking about this is the speed, the sheer speed with which it all unfolded.
Yeah, the analysis really emphasizes that point. It was incredibly fast. Russian troops, they were deployed in late February, and then the annexation referendum, it was held in mid-March. It was over before most people could even really process what was happening.
So it seems like that probably caught the U.S. off guard, at least to some extent.
I think it's safe to say that they were surprised by how quickly it all happened. And if we zoom out a bit, put this in the broader context, this was also a time when U.S.-China relations were starting to get more complicated, more tense. And you had Obama's pivot to Asia strategy, the idea of shifting more U.S. resources and attention to the Asia-Pacific region, partly to counter China's growing influence. And part of that strategy, interestingly enough, involved the idea of potentially bringing Russia on board, trying to get Russia to help contain China.
So the U.S. was trying to get Russia on their side to push back against China. But then Russia goes and annexes Crimea, which, doesn't exactly send the message of hey, we're on the same page here.
Right. Right. And it makes you wonder if maybe Russia saw an opportunity in all of this. If they recognized that they were in this unique position, this position of leverage between the two superpowers. Maybe they thought, hey, we can use this to our advantage. We can play both sides.
That's a really interesting point. And then, of course, you have Russia's intervention in Syria starting in 2015. How does that factor into this whole tangled web of relationships?
Syria, it's another example of Russia really projecting its power, stepping onto the world stage. And what's particularly interesting here is the alignment with Iran. They were both supporting the Assad regime. They were both fighting against Sunni insurgent groups like Daesh or ISIS. And the analysis, it lays out the timeline, the airstrike starting in late September 2015, the ongoing presence, the withdrawal last year when Turkish-backed forces moved in. It's a complicated story, but I think the takeaway is that Russia is willing to get involved in these messy conflicts, these proxy wars, to pursue its own interests.
And now we come to 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I mean, that was a massive turning point, right?
Yeah.
How did that change the game?
Yeah, the invasion of Ukraine, it was a huge shock to the system, and it triggered a pretty strong response from the U.S. and Europe, a commitment to support Ukraine, to help them defend themselves. But the analysis makes a really important point here. It points out that the aid that's been provided, it's been somewhat limited. It's been kind of incremental, kind of cautious. And there's a sense that maybe the U.S. and Europe, they haven't fully grasped the scale of the challenge, the long-term implications of this conflict.
And it seems like there's a bit of a shift happening now in 2025, a shift in Europe's thinking about all of this.
Yeah, you're seeing European countries, they're starting to ramp up their own defense spending. They're starting to talk more seriously about taking a more assertive stance. And some of this seems to be driven by signals coming from the U.S. There were those hints from Trump about a possible deal with Russia, and that seems to have really spooked a lot of European leaders. They're thinking, well, if the U.S. is going to cut a deal with Russia, then we need to be prepared to go it alone to defend ourselves.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at the history, the strategies, the current state of play. But the big question is, can the U.S. actually pull this off? Can they really separate Russia from China? And the analysis we're looking at, it's not very optimistic, is it?
No, I wouldn't say that it's optimistic. The core argument is that Russia just doesn't have much incentive to switch sides, to align itself with the U.S. They've got their own agenda, they've got their own interests, and they've got this increasingly strong relationship with China. And the analysis points out that in the past, despite various attempts, nothing really came of it. So the question is, what's changed? Why would things be different this time around?
And speaking of China, it doesn't sound like they're too worried about U.S. pressure.
That statement from Premier Li Qiang back in March, it was pretty telling. Talking about China being ready to face external challenges while also emphasizing their commitment to attracting foreign investment. It's like they're saying, we're not going to be pushed around. We're going to do things our way.
But the really concerning part of this whole analysis, I think, is the potential damage to U.S. alliances.
Absolutely. The author argues that any kind of deal with Russia, it would likely come at a huge cost to U.S. relationships in Europe and Asia. And they give some pretty stark economic data to back that up. The combined economies of the EU, the UK, Norway, they're actually bigger than China's. And Japan's economy, it's way bigger than Russia's. So the point is, these alliances, they're not just, symbolic, they're incredibly valuable to the U.S., both strategically and economically.
And it sounds like those alliances, they might already be fraying at the edges.
Yeah, there's a trend that the analysis points to, countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they seem to be moving closer to the UK. Maybe they're not, abandoning the US alliance altogether, but they're definitely hedging their bets. They're looking for other options.
So what's the bottom line here? What's the harsh reality that we have to face?
The reality is that if the U.S. keeps pushing this strategy, if they keep trying to play Russia off against China, they risk alienating their own allies. And that could end up being far more damaging in the long run than anything Russia or China could do.
And what's the most likely outcome? What does the analysis predict?
The prediction is that neither Russia nor China is going to make a deal that would really, undermine their own interests. They're not going to sacrifice their own strategic goals just to please the U.S. They might string America along for a while, but ultimately they're going to do what they think is best for themselves.
It sounds like the U.S. might have miscalculated here. They might have underestimated how their allies would react to this whole outreach to Russia.
Yeah, it's possible that they didn't fully anticipate the level of concern, the level of anxiety among their allies, and that's created an opening for Russia, for China to exploit those divisions, to widen those cracks in the alliance.
So what's the solution? What does the U.S. need to do differently?
The analysis really emphasizes the need for a new approach, a bolder vision. And that vision has to include, talking to your adversaries, trying to find common ground, but it also has to prioritize, has to really emphasize the importance of alliances, of working with your partners. You can't just throw your allies under the bus to try to score points against your rivals.
So for you, the listener, what's the key takeaway from all of this? I mean, this has been a pretty dense conversation.
Well, I think the main point is that this is a really complicated situation. This idea of separating Russia from China, it's not as simple as it sounds, and it's fraught with risks, especially risks to those very alliances that the U.S. relies on for its global influence.
Right. And the analysis we've been discussing, it suggests that a quick fix, a sudden breakthrough, it's pretty unlikely. This is a long game, and it's going to require a lot of careful thought, a lot of strategic nuance.
And that leads to a really interesting question, I think, a question for all of us to consider. Given all of these complexities, given all of these risks, what are the alternatives? What other strategies could the U.S. pursue to achieve its goals, to protect its interests without jeopardizing those crucial relationships with its allies? It's a tough question. I don't think there are any easy answers, but it's a question that we need to be asking ourselves, that we need to be debating.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap things up for today. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.